It's ad break time. The Beyond Solitaire podcast is proudly sponsored by Central Michigan University's Center for Learning Through Games and Simulations. And as usual, they are up to some amazing things. They recently concluded a successful campaign on Backer Kit for Eyeball to Eyeball, a LARP about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Late pledges should be available soon. CLGS is also still offering a certificate in applied game design, and the next class is going to be It's All in the Cards, designing card and card-driven games, taught by Damon Stone. He's a brilliant teacher, and his students love him, so you should sign up. The course starts August 26th. Also, just a quick plug for myself. If you want to support the show and help keep it going, please do go to patreon.com/beyondsolitaire, which pays for all of my hosting and subscriptions associated with the podcast and channel. Thank you so much for listening, and let's get on with the show. Hey, gamers, this is Liz Davidson for Beyond Solitaire, and this week on the pod, I'm very excited to have a special guest. This is Connor Alexander. He's a game designer and owner of Coyote and Crow Games. How you doing today, Connor?
I am doing amazing. Thanks. I had a lovely Gen Con 2024, and I'm feeling really invigorated coming off of that. So it's good stuff.
Yes, I'm currently. So, for those of you who are tuning out, we are recording immediately post convention. So, I'm in that exhilarated but also tired spot.
Same. Big same.
But I also let's just go ahead and lead off with the
Yeah.
exciting stuff that's going on. You were by the time this episode runs, you're going to be just a couple of days from finishing a new
Yes.
Kickstarter campaign. So why don't you tell us about Ahutico and what's in it for people who want to get to the business with the timestamp on it?
Yeah. So Ahutico is the first really full expansion for the Coyote and Crow role-playing game. We did have Stories of the Freelands, which were a collection of one-shot adventures that were sort of built to help get people going in that world. But from the get-go, I really wanted to create a setting that was a little different than maybe some setting books in role-playing games. You know, a lot of setting books, especially if you're talking about something like Dungeons and Dragons, they tend to be a large geographical space with a lot of maps and they're covering a lot of territory in a very sort of macro kind of feel. And to me, the most interesting thing about role playing games are those really cool character interaction moments. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love big battles and everything, but those sort of more interesting NPC encounters. And I wanted to create a setting that was very small. So this is Ahutico is the name of a single fictional village set in the Pacific Northwest. And we get heavily into the details of these NPCs and their lives and the deep, dark horror and mystery elements that are the sort of the foundations of this town, and all of the secrets and lies that these people have that tie them together. And so the characters, hopefully coming into this small town, will just get immersed into this deep lore. And that's the kind of thing that I like in role-playing games. And it's the one I've been wanting to do pretty much since I created Coyote and Crow. So I'm happy to get around to it.
That's fantastic. So I noticed on the campaign, it says that you
Mm-hmm.
don't need to be able to play Coyote and Crow or even own the game to enjoy the book. So how did you create something that fits in with your previous game,
Yeah.
but is also like free of having to get it?
Yeah. So there's two factors there. One is as a longtime role playing game fan, I know that there's a lot of times I'll buy a role playing game book because I support the author or I like the theme or whatever it is, and then my group never gets time to get it to the table, right? So right away, I wanted folks who like to collect RPG books but don't necessarily have the time to want to do just more than maybe thumb through the art real quick and go, "Oh, this is a really nice book," and then just put it back on their shelf. So the other aspect to this is that I think in Coyote and Crow specifically, we lean heavily on this idea of collaborative storytelling, and numbers are not quite as important as theater of the mind. And so I wanted to create a book that, yes, it has game stats in it. Yes, it has game mechanics. It absolutely does. But in a lot of the mysteries that are laid out, specifically the ones that we call out, but there's also other mysteries in there too. So we call out a number of mysteries. But if you start paying attention to these NPCs, there are a lot of unanswered questions. And so I started thinking about the ideas of creating something beyond just what's on the page. And I don't want to give too much away, but there's already content out there about Ahutiko that is not on my website, and it's not in the book, that people can find that's out there. And on top of that, we're going to have a whole system of cryptography that is in the book, and there's a reason for that cryptography in the book. That once people start to figure out what it is, it will lead them to other multimedia clues, PDFs, MP3s, all different kinds of like art and journal entries and things like that. They're going to tie into these mysteries. I've never been a fan of having big mysteries spelled out for me. So some of the larger mysteries we're never going to give an answer to. We're just going to give a heap of clues and people can come to their own conclusions. And so I love the idea that a reader can just pick this up and go, you know what? I want to try to figure out who killed Wicketon. Wicketon's death is one of the major mysteries in the book. And you could probably spend 20 or 30 hours going through just the physical book, let alone the other multimedia stuff, trying to figure out who killed Wicketon. So yeah, and again, there are game mechanics in there too. If you actually want to play through this, there's ways to sit down and go through the game mechanics. But the game mechanics still aren't going to tell you who killed Wicketon.
Oh, that's really interesting. So you mentioned that there's not always an answer to some of the mysteries. Is it
Yeah,
possible to actually solve the mystery of who killed Bickerton?
yeah. So I sort of subscribe to there's a number of directors out there that I like and writers that I like who will lay out all the information and then just sort of say, you know what, come to your own conclusion. Um, like specifically with the death of Wicketon, I know who killed Wicketon and I know how it happened, but I'm never going to answer that, and I'm never going to confirm or deny anybody's suspicions or hypotheses on it. I don't think that's fun. I think it's better to come up with your own one and let sort of conspiracy theories run wild.
Oh, that's really funny. That actually makes me think a bit of Pentiment, which is one of my favorite video games of the past few years. Where
Which
you're
game?
Pentiment. You
Ooh,
basically
I
play
don't think
a
I played that
medieval.
one.
Oh, it's fantastic. You play a medieval artist like who gets roped into solving some mysteries, but the game never tells you if you're right about the people that you accuse.
Oh, I love that.
So,
I love that. I'm gonna have to check that out. That sounds great. It's right up my alley.
um, yeah, I like the idea that you're supposed to dig into the world and kind of work it out yourself and like figure out
Yeah,
your
yeah.
relationships to different characters and what your assumptions say about you, the evidence, what you're able to find. That's really cool.
Yeah. I mean, I love the idea that there's going to be some story guide out there, hopefully, who reads through this book and says, I think this person is who killed Wicketon, so I'm going to structure my game setting around that concept and see if the characters actually come to the same conclusion. Maybe they won't. Maybe they'll completely pin it on someone else. Who knows?
Oh, that's awesome. Ahutigo does kind
Yeah.
of fit into the larger world of Coyote and Crow, and you first crowdfunded for Coyote and Crow in 2022. Is that correct?
It crowdfunded in 2021 and then
Got it.
hit retail and backers by 2022. Yeah.
So basically, you've had a whirlwind few years post pandemic.
Yeah. Yeah,
That's
it's been a strange ride for sure. I originally had planned an $18,000 goal. This was a side project I was doing during my I worked full time in the game industry prior to that for a distributor, and I didn't really expect to do anything other than maybe get my money back on what I was trying to put out there. And I think once it started to pass the $500,000 mark, I started to seriously question about, and this is a really interesting situation I'm in that's sort of coming to fruition right now, is that I felt like I had an obligation to not just put out what I had offered on the Kickstarter, but what sort of greater obligation do I have to my community, to my gaming community, and to my native community, as far as having this platform been offered to me to promote native games and indigenous concepts in games. And so I quit my day job and started Coyote and Crow Games. But what I'm learning and what I've learned since 2022, and I've really engaged in this, is that there's already enough weight on game publishers in this industry just to survive. And I think tacking on the not only the goal of trying to uplift a marginalized audience through my games, but then also um, sort of treating my company as a nonprofit, even when it's not a nonprofit. Like I'm trying to do a lot of altruistic stuff. That's just, it's too much to bear for one person, and I'm a one person company right now. It's too much weight on a capitalist structure. So I think, and I haven't gone into details on this. I'm going to have a larger announcement on my website probably in the next month or so, after Ahutico finishes. Is that I'm really going to be restructuring what Coyote and Crow Games is. I'm still going to be making games, but how we go about making those games and how they get into people's hands is going to seriously be changing. I just can't keep up the mode that I'm in right now, because I'm literally wearing, publisher hat, game designer hat, project manager hat, social media marketing hat, and I'm stretched a little thin. So
Yeah, it sounds. We'll be looking out for an announcement, but let's talk about
yeah,
how you got here. So it sounds like when you first published Coyote and Crow, the tabletop RPG, you didn't
yeah.
imagine that there would be a company of the same name. That wasn't the plan at all.
No, no. In fact, it was not incorporated. Like literally everything was going through my personal bank account, and the jockeying of that money, that $1.07 million from Kickstarter to my own personal bank account, was a bit shocking and unnerving. And then while the campaign was going, I was literally hiring attorneys to get incorporated and get everything set up so that I could manage this as a real business. Um, and that was a lot of learning along the way. I've been a small business owner in the past, but it was a long time ago under very different circumstances. So it's a bit of a shock, and I had to do a lot of quick thinking. Um, Hence the original idea. Like I literally picked Coyote and Crow Games LLC out of my butt because I just didn't know at the time what else to name it, and I was in a hurry, and I probably would have given it a different name.
So, what were your original intentions for the RPG? Where did you think it would go, and who did you initially think that it would reach?
Yeah. So my original goal, uh, my original bar for success was this. I said, I want one native kid who I don't know personally to come up to me at a convention and go, I played your game and I really liked it. That was my only goal, right? Because I honestly thought that my game was going to go out to a few hundred people who were personal friends or hardcore RPGers who were native, and that was going to be the end of it. That was really it. And once I started to realize that there was something there beyond, there was a greater demand than I'd expected. I realized that, oh well, now I've got an opportunity to bring in more writers, more artists, do a nicer cover, put more real effort into this, and along that way, I think my second goal then became, I want this book to feel like it can sit alongside an RPG shelf along with any D&D book, any Paizo book, any, Shadowrun book. I want it to feel like a legit RPG. And I think I accomplished that. I mean, I'm really proud of the way that book looks and feels. Um, it's a beast of a book, but it's beautiful, and I'm so proud of it. So from there, though, that sort of set the bar for everything else, right? Like that sort of set the bar for what I wanted as a company, was to not feel like we're doing stuff on the cheap or low rent, or half-assed. I wanted real quality products to be coming out. And I think we've maintained that level of quality. What we haven't done is maintained the pace that I wanted. I originally wanted like 2 games per year coming out with maybe some other supplements too. And right now we're doing like one a year. And that's partly just because of my bandwidth. So, mm,
Yeah, that's fair. So, I actually ended up wanting to interview you because I've interviewed people who have worked on your project with you. So last season of the podcast,
mm,
I talked to Coyote Oldbear,
yeah,
and I also have known Will Thompson for several years now,
yeah,
from his
yeah.
initial
Good
entry to the
folks.
Zenobia Award. So
Yeah.
it sounds also like, were you planning to bring in as many people as you did on the RPG initially, or did you use the funding that you got to expand the game and then
Yeah.
bring in more
Yeah.
people to work on it?
So I think from the start, like early in my development process, I knew I didn't have a broad enough voice or a broad enough wealth of knowledge to make the game world feel as lived in as I wanted it to be. And I knew that that was going to take collaborative effort. It was going to take a lot of voices to sort of bring that to life. What the funding did was it allowed me to grow that even further. I already sort of had my core writers in mind, whether that was Coyote or Derek Pounds or whoever. I already kind of knew those folks, but it allowed me to expand on it a lot. Like we really expanded on the fictional in-game language, the conlang Chahi. That allowed us a lot more breadth on that. And it allowed me to go from what I think was originally about 25 artists to almost 50. Um, and going back to Ahutiko for a second on that, there was very much some intentionality when it came to making sure in the core book that we had a broad representation of artists from all over, trying to bring in as many kind of styles and feels. I wanted to sort of underline and sort of underscore the idea that natives are not a monolithic culture, that we all have very different styles of dress and attitudes and cultural traditions and all these other things going on. And so I felt like having a pile of artists on that would really help that. With Ahutiko, we're sort of going the other way. And because this is such a singular location, I really wanted to work with a single artist. And so I'm really excited to be working with Jillian Dolan as my sole artist for the book. And that's great because it allows her to really kind of um, create and set a tone for the book that really kind of goes for what we want, which is horror and mystery.
Oh, that's really cool. Actually, it also leads to another question that I had, which is,
Yeah,
we know that Native people are not a monolith.
yeah,
America and I mean, America, not just the United States, right,
yeah,
contains multitudes.
yeah.
So, how did you, I guess, do your best to make sure that you were representing as many voices as possible, knowing that you were going to miss someone or something?
Yeah, so that was a conversation our sort of team had early on, which is as how do you represent hundreds of nations and tribes, some federally recognized, some not, all over the country. And I think one of the things we did early on was we decided to minimize referencing specific real world nations wherever we could, because we don't want to feel like they got preferential treatment or this nation got mentioned but this other one didn't, right? So
Right.
we created these fictional nations within the world that sort of were overarching governments of these real world nations. And my hope has always been that I'm not Ojibwe. I would love it if I had an Ojibwe writer come forward and say, "Hey, I want to write a piece on how the Ojibwe nation survived or persevered through all the events of Coyote and Crow and where they're at now." That's great. Like they can take that on, and that leaves them that space. So I really kind of went into it with a sort of a sandbox feel. I wanted to create, hey, here's what happened. Here's this fictional world. I'm not going to tell you what happened to your nation. I want you to tell me what happened and how does it fit into this world. And I think that's worked out really well so far. It's left every room or everyone some room to play in, which I think is important. Everybody needs to feel included. I would love it though if down the line, people pitched me ideas for their alternate histories on their nations. That would be fantastic.
That was awesome. Another thing that I talked about with Will last time I had him on the show was he
Hmm.
mentioned that he actually had a cultural consultant to assist with Winter Rabbit, even though he himself
Yeah,
is Cherokee. Is that something
absolutely.
that you did for Coyote and Crow? And if
So we
not, is
had
that
we
something
had
that you would have done?
No, so first of all, because so much of our stuff was fictionalized, and we weren't pulling specifically from real world traditions, instead, and I love first of all, I love Winter Rabbit. It's about to go into Kickstarter and check it out. I am so hyped for Will's game. It's amazing. Um, I think what we did differently is that we all sort of cross checked each other, because all the writers were native on board and we were all very intentionally spread out from different regions of the country and different backgrounds.
Yeah.
We all sort of pitched into each other and consulted with each other, which worked out really nice. And then in addition, we also brought in a LGBTQ and sexuality consultant on some of the stuff too. That was completely separate consulting. And I think that worked out really well. Because, if you look through specifically like the legends and icon sections, there are some of those that are made from whole cloth. They have nothing to do with traditional native legends or lore, and instead pull from mythology that would have been created in this alternate universe in Coyote and Crow. But then there's others like Ninian, who's this stone man character that's in the book. He's pulled from Cherokee lore, and so it was up to me at that point to go, I need to differentiate this enough that it is safe for non-native audiences to consume, but still close enough that if you're Cherokee and you read that you're going to go, "Oh, I know what he's referencing here. I get it. I get what he's calling back to here." And I think that's a good way to do it. I think for Coyote and Crow, I wouldn't necessarily suggest that model for non-native game designers to just look up indigenous stuff and then think they know what they're doing and then try to strip the direct cultural references out, because I think a lot of times they don't know where they're getting their information from, and that might be bad information to begin with. So it's better to just hire, in general, I feel like it's better to hire a consultant at the start of your game development rather than at the end.
Oh, that's a good point. So I want to go back to something you just said, which is making the game
Yeah.
safe for non-indigenous players to consume. What do
Yeah.
you mean by that? And has your feeling about what would fall into that range changed over time or developed?
So I think when it comes to what's safe, I think there's some intentional distance that I put into the whole book, right? Into the whole entire book, where I wanted both natives to be able to play the game comfortably and to be able to insert their own backgrounds and heritage into the game, while simultaneously I wanted an entirely like a group of just white people to just be able to sit down and play the game as it's written in the book without ever accidentally being appropriative or disrespectful to any particular culture. And I think there had to be a level of homogenization and or watering down of certain elements when it came to, like, the example I love to use is the skill in the game called ceremony. It has a very specific game mechanic that non-natives can use. It just has a game mechanic thing. It's a skill. You do a ceremony, you get some of your soul points back. That's it. That's the end of it. But I also have a call out box in the book that says, hey, if you're native, feel free to talk to your story guide and adjust what the ceremony skill does. Maybe it has multiple uses. Maybe it has something completely different that you want to bring in from your culture to strap onto the ceremony skill. And I think that's a great example of where that sort of sandbox idea, where it's safe for non-natives but still accessible and valuable to native audiences.
Yeah, I think one of the things that people have noted over the years too about Cody and Crow are the boxes of how to
Hmm.
play safely as a non-native and what parts of the game you should not engage
Yeah,
with in
for
certain
better or
forms,
worse. Yeah, people have
for better or
noticed.
worse. I mean, I actually thought it was cool because it gave me a sense of, what boundaries might be there
Yeah.
that I would not know. But do you still feel that they were a good add-in, and do you continue to put that in other games or?
So I've not added them to other games because I haven't felt the need to yet. My other games like Wolves or Nasi are very straightforward board games and don't have a lot of like role playing interactions or ways you could be appropriative. But I do feel like the negative feedback I've got on those call out boxes almost underscores the need for them, because I think the people who were never going to be problematic in the first place, they read them and just went, "Oh yeah, cool. It's common sense. It just makes sense. These are nice little guidelines. I wouldn't have done these anyway, but it's nice that they're here." But I think the folks who have problems with them are the folks that it almost acts as like a warning flag sign, like, we knew you were going to be this way, so we're calling it out right here in the book. And I think those people were never really going to be engaging in the game anyway, not in good faith. So I'm fine with that.
Right, I mean, that's fair.
Yeah.
Um, so the other thing I find Coyote and Crow super interesting just as a thought exercise, and actually, you've got the shirt on, decolonize gaming.
Yeah,
How
decolonize your gaming.
how do you decolonize your gaming? How do you separate
Um,
enough from
yeah,
our
that's a great
culture and
question.
context to get there?
So, so I think so. Decolonize your gaming sort of has two meanings. One is I just wanted to for consumers. I just wanted to sort of make them think about what it is they're playing. There I think there are a variety of games out there where just the core mechanics themselves are a colonized mindset, right? Like this idea of like taking a piece of land on a board and then using that land for its resources to take over more land. I think there's some core concepts there in a lot, especially a lot of like Euro games that have that baked in. And that's not necessarily. I'm not trying to necessarily say that those games are all evil or bad or I don't like them. Or I mean, that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just trying to bring awareness to thinking about the mechanics that you're using and you're playing, and thinking about the themes that you're engaging with. But there was also sort of for me personally, there was a more underneath kind of like a subliminal level of jab at some other publishers out there who I think use native concepts or native themes or more broadly outside of America's more indigenous themes in their games without really thinking it through at all, without even hiring a consultant sometimes. And that's still really common in our hobby. For every native published game, native designer or artist that gets out there in the game world, there are 5 white publishers out there who are making really obnoxious, tacky, appropriative, disrespectful, insulting games, whether it's their name or their art or their lack of representation or consultation, or just getting like some of the worst stuff I'm seeing is like people just completely mixing up things like totem poles with teepees and really like obnoxious stuff. And so I think this is sort of a jab at them. I kind of want them to start thinking about the fact that they're just stomping all over our cultures here.
Yeah, I mean that would make sense. And then there's a larger question that I just always think about this as a historian.
Yeah.
I feel like it's when I look back at historical things that I study, I feel like it's so easy to see like where people's worldviews get formed and like assumptions they're
Mhm.
making from my perspective, but I don't know how to see myself. And so how when you look at Coyote and Crow, right? It
Mhm.
creates a world where indigenous cultures have been able to grow and thrive without interference from
Yeah.
European colonial activity. How do you create a world that doesn't still bear the scars of that just because that's the world we grew up in?
Yeah, that was actually one of my very first hurdles when I was like, even before this was an RPG and I just had the concept in mind that I wanted to create a game. The first thing I sort of had to engage with was how am I going to create something that doesn't force people, native people, to re-engage with their own trauma, with their own colonial trauma. And the more I thought about that, the more I thought, man, I just don't want to revisit that. Like I don't want people to have to play a game that's supposed to be an escape for them and have to have them revisit those things. So I think the only choice I was left with was how do we create a world, a setting where colonialism never even happened in the first place? Colonization just didn't occur. And so I had to go back in time and create like a fork in time. And I credit that entirely to my love of science fiction and all of the other, both the reading, the novels, comics, movies I've read over the years that have thrown the idea of alternate timelines out there. But once that idea clicked, it blossomed. I mean, it was a beautiful little seed in my brain because it just alleviated so many problems, and it allowed me to then highlight so many positive things about Native culture in a way that there's a term floating around out there called indigenous futurism, and I
Yes.
think I think right now is a great time for that phrase to be rising because Native people, I think, uh, just sort of because of the systemic nature of our existence in North America, we're often put in positions where we don't have time to think about the future. We're barely being able to hold on to the past or pay our rent or pay our bills or whatever it is. We're dealing with the present or the past, and I think we're finally at a spot where we can start taking some of the lessons of our past of our cultures and going, well, how would those apply to the future? And so for me, it was so much. There was so much joy in collaborating with my writers on Coyote and Crow and going, well, what would this take this and what would it look like in the future? What would it look like technologically, culturally, aesthetically? Um, just the idea, of corn. Just take corn for a very base example, and you talk about how much importance it's had to so many cultures across North America. And then you look at the idea of like, oh, well, we have all these current like monocultures, and uses for corn where we've lost a number of the varieties. So many of our hundreds of varieties have been lost of corn because of current agricultural systems, right? But then you look at Coyote and Crow and you go, oh well, if that hadn't happened, what would people have done with corn? What could it have become? And then you look at the ideas of like plastics based on corn, or the idea that like you could use corn for so many different synthetic materials besides plastic, or like we've got in the game these things called GATs, which are 3D printers that use biological mass. So when you've got like food waste, you're simply dumping your food waste into a processor, and then that's going toward a 3D printed object. Um, and so just ideas like that, and working with my fellow writers to come up with those kinds of ideas, and digging through tech journals and going, hey, what's cutting edge right now that in our real world that is just getting around to the idea of sustainability and thinking about the resources we're using rather than just stripping them from our earth.
Oh, that's really interesting. So, would it be accurate to say that then sort of creating a decolonized future is not so much
Hmm.
about getting it right every time and perfectly separating out, but it's more about the imaginative exercise of what could be, and then it's kind of an
Yes.
emotional easing of the baggage we're all carrying around.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And I think one of the things that drew me to this, to be an RPG in the first place, was that RPGs for me very much run parallel to native oral storytelling traditions, right? And so the idea of having this world with the colonization end stripped away leaves players in a place where they can go to the same points of drama that we all have in life, that all humans have, whether it's greed or murder or love or jealousy, or all of these things that just human beings face. Those become the challenges in Coyote and Crow. The mystery of the unknown, fighting over a particular resource. You still have national interests, and you still have cultures butting heads. All of those things are real, and I think giving an opportunity for natives and non-natives to be able to engage in those kinds of stories without the colonization stuff is just fun and different.
It's funny that you bring up, yes, that people are still dealing with human conflicts and human emotions because that's actually something you felt the need to blog about multiple times
Mm.
over the years. Because one of the complaints about Coyote and Crow is that there is insufficient conflict. I don't know how you have. I mean, I can't imagine a situation without conflict really that involves humans. But
Right. I honestly feel like that's a bad faith argument from people who haven't fully read the book, but I've called it out because I mean there's an entire chapter on genre hooks and plot hooks in the book. We talk about how you could have a war setting where some of these nations have gone to war. There's horror settings, there's mystery settings, there's like urban noir detective settings you can do. Literally almost anything you can think of in any other genre, you can still do in Coyote and Crow. You can make this feel like any other genre. And, I mean, even if you wanted to go the traditional Dungeons and Dragons route of a group of people going exploring, hey, put them all onto a boat or send them north into the ice cap and just have them go adventuring, right? You can do anything you want. Um, And I think that that complaint comes from a it comes from a narrative laziness. I think it comes from a people who are so used to, especially in the RPG community, who are so used to having storylines fed to them through a traditional genre meat grinder. This whole, hey, I'm hiring you to go here, and then you must go here and kill this person and take this thing and then go do this thing, and then you'll be done. um, that frankly to me, I got bored of that like when I was like 14. That kind of thinking, like, don't get me wrong, I played a ton of Dungeons and Dragons modules over the years, tons of them. But most of the time, I broke away from them as a DM. I would break away from them and start telling my own stories and start inserting my own NPCs because frankly, that linear kind of storytelling it's more built for like the miniatures on a table, right? Like it's more built for maps and minis than it is for storytelling.
Right. So one thing that's also very interesting, I think, about some of the things you've posted online, kind of within this set of arguments, is that
Mm,
people also talk about I mean, we discussed it earlier, right? Like, absolutely, white people can go ahead and play Coyote and Crow. It's made
yeah.
for everybody. But one of the comments that you made that I thought was great was you said, if you made a game that was about cats in space fighting space dogs, but indigenous creators made it, it would still be a game from an indigenous perspective.
Yes.
What what makes uh what makes a game have an indigenous perspective, and how does that show up differently from more sort
Mm.
of colonized game themes that we've talked about earlier?
You might be disappointed by my answer here, but and I suspect Will would back me up on this.
I'm
What
never
makes a
disappointed.
game indigenous is having an indigenous designer. A perfect example is Will's game Paleovet. It's a game about healing dinosaurs. That's an indigenous game because Will is a Cherokee, and that's all it really takes. I think to more fully flesh out your question here in my answer, I would say that my goal is as an indigenous designer is currently to be able to try to insert some of my indigenous culture and the other people I work with who are indigenous and insert their culture and ideas into my games where I can, because I feel like those concepts are underrepresented in the overall hobby industry. A perfect example is both Winter Rabbit that Will's working on, and then my game Wolves. Both of those games are semi cooperative, and they sort of reject the idea of a zero sum win. They say, hey, we all need to make it across the finish line. We all the players have to make it across the finish line. Yes, there is an individual winner, but if anyone else fails along the way, you've all failed each other, and you all lose the game. And there's not a lot of games that do that. And I think that's a really easy surface example of trying to insert mechanics or themes or ideas into the games that we create that are not typically seen in a lot of titles out there right now.
I also want to go back to something that you mentioned earlier. So I think that you and I actually probably come to similar conclusions on this, but
Mm,
I just want to record this for posterity. I think it's important
sure,
in our current game culture. So
sure.
you mentioned that one of the reasons that you wanted to take kind of European colonialism out of Coyote and Crow was so that you could have a space where indigenous players can just have fun, like free of trauma, as much as possible, and just
Yeah,
enjoy the setting. I
yeah.
feel like there is a mirror argument from the other side of the fence where people say, take politics out of my games. Games are just for fun. Just let me have my fun. How are those two perspectives inherently different?
Mm. Well, I fundamentally disagree with the idea that games are not political. I actually had somebody when this topic came up in a person or a face to face conversation. I had somebody use the example of chess as a non political game, and I literally burst out laughing at them. And I said, "You realize you're literally playing pieces that are named after a monarchical system, right? You've got kings and queens and pawns. That's how is that not political, right? Like it's a, but deeper than that, that's the surface level theme of chess. I think you take it just one level deeper, just peel the skin back just a tiny bit. You've got a game that says there are only two players, they are automatically adversaries, and only one player can win, and you do it by cornering the most important piece on the board. All of that is super political. All of that has a very clear statement about what is important, what is not, and how the world works. And I fully believe that every game is making a political statement. You may not be aware of it, but that's on that person, not on the designer. And so it's actually, I think, incumbent upon the designers out there to they don't necessarily have to make a literal statement in the rules guide, but I think they need to think about it when they're creating their game. Every mechanic and every thematic choice and every piece of art is making a statement, whether you realize it or not.
I agree with you so much that I'm pretty sure I've said something along those lines on a previous episode. But I think it's always worth talking about. About maybe
Absolutely.
kind
It
of
cannot be said enough. It cannot be said enough. Until everybody just assumes it's a truism, we need to keep saying it.
yeah, like it's never just a game. Every single
Yeah.
game is an artifact of its culture, and it has some kind of
Yes.
perspective. Like,
Absolutely. 100%.
so speaking of sort of perspectives that are on offer, so you've designed both RPGs and board games.
Yes.
What do you think is? I mean, obviously, I'm not a big RPG person. I'm a big analog board game person. But
Mm-hmm.
how do the scopes of expression like differ for games like that, both in terms of keeping players safe, but also kind of pushing them imaginatively?
So RPGs are a big ask, right? Like you're talking about a form of play that is not only pretty niche as far as its overall popularity, but then you're also talking about a high cost to entry. I mean, my book is $70, and I don't. I really understand that that's difficult. I mean, it's one of the reasons we're trying to donate so many to libraries and things, so other players can get their hands on them. Um, I think one of the things I first decided when Coyote and Crow took off, and I knew that this was going to be a publishing company and not just a one-off game, was I knew that one of my goals was to get more modern board games into the hands of natives, because I can't count how many times I've spoken to natives who don't know anything beyond Monopoly and Clue and Risk, all of which are awful examples of board games, right? Like, and I'm not saying you can't like those games. I'm just saying that those games are not examples of modern board game mechanics or themes or ideas. They're antiquated. They don't really provide good modern cultural context for anything. So I think I really quickly realized that because there's this high barrier to entry with role playing, and because they're so expensive, that if I want to speak to a wider native audiences, I need to create situations where a family can spend $40. They don't have to worry about a separate dice. They don't have to worry about rolling up character sheets or whatever it is. They can spend $40 on one box that gets them all at the table for 1 hour, and then they still feel as though they've not only experienced something new in terms of mechanics and overall game experience, but that they then also see something of themselves in that game, something of their culture. Nasi, my dice game is very much based on just like a lot of traditional games of chance, of native games of chance, like Peach Pits and Sticks. And so I hope that when natives play the game, they see that and they feel that and they feel a little connected to the game, while simultaneously going, oh, this isn't like anything I've played from a modern board game before. Those two feelings, I think, need to go together so that you get natives out there going, hey, I don't have to just go to Walmart and pick up another edition of Monopoly. I can get something else. And simultaneously, the flip side is also very important, which is non-natives need to see games and go, oh, huh, okay, this is made by a native designer, and there's something different about this game. I feel like there's something here that I'm not seeing in other games, and maybe this is the native influence. And maybe that's even spelled out in the rules or whatever it is. I think we mentioned Peach Pit and Sticks in the Nasi rules. So maybe if they read the rule book, they're like, "Oh, okay, cool. I've got a little bit of more of a concrete idea of what like natives think about with gaming."
Yeah. So what's really cool about what you're saying is I really respect your attempts to reach like a dual audience. But one thing I have noticed in your writing online is that one of the things that's frustrated you the most is that you've had a hard time getting your games into native households and to
Yes.
native players. So I guess how do we fix that? I mean, it's like sort of the core problem of board gaming, right? How do you grow the audience?
Yeah.
How do you invite more people in?
Yeah.
I mean,
So my company is not a nonprofit, right? But I'm having to think about things in a different way, and this goes a lot to some of the changes that are going to be coming up in the next couple of months for me. We're not a nonprofit, and I can't currently, I've got to pay rent too, right? So I think what it comes down to is that there needs to be more ways for natives to interact with these titles in a way where they're not having to put money up front. I think the perfect example is there was recently a conference, a native conference in just outside of Portland, Oregon, and they contacted me, and their organization ended up buying like I don't know, it was a few $100s worth of Coyote and Crow games, and then just put them out on the tables to play at the conference, and then gave them out to folks at the end of the game or at the end of the day. And I think that's a great example of how I think it's gonna take a while, but these games and these ideas are gonna slowly seep out to native culture. I wish I had the bandwidth and the time to go to more powwows because, frankly, I every time I've gone to a powwow and I talk to folks about Coyote and Crow, they are not only just blown away, but they had no clue that I existed. And so my
oh
reach
wow.
has been primarily to game audiences, and then within that, natives that are already in the game audience. So what I need to be able to do is start communicating more to the groups outside of the gaming sphere, as it were. And that's going to be a
Oh,
long process, and I think it's going to take more things like the Oregon situation to do that.
that's really really interesting. So for Coyote and Crow as a publisher in its current form, how
Hmm.
do you decide which games should be published? And are there things that you wish you could change, given that
Oh,
you're also hoping to spread indigenous perspectives and not just create games that'll make money?
that is the grossest question you could possibly ask me.
Is that are you mad? Should I not ask it?
No, 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 no. You're okay. You're okay. Leave it in. It's good. It's good. When I say gross, I mean that those decisions are some of the most difficult for me. I'll give you a really good example right now. People have been clamoring for more RPG content. And when I say people, I mean fans, people I'm directly interacting with a lot, have been clamoring for more RPG content. And I want to give them what they want, partially because I like pleasing my fans, but also because I know that financially is going to um, be a fallback for me as far as being able to keep the company going. And I can't produce other games if I don't keep the company going. The trick then is then how do I squeeze in these other titles? Like there's a title I've been working on for a while now called Seven Clans. The prototype box is actually right there. Um, how do I get that game out? Because that game is not set in the world of Coyote and Crow. It is a game about traditional Cherokee culture. And how do I have that game rise to the surface? It's not going to do well on crowdfunding because it's kind of a niche game and it's coming from an RPG publisher. I mean, yeah, it might get funded, but it's probably going to be from the same 10,000 or so people that I'm already speaking to, which means I'm not really growing my audience. So that game I've had to put on the back burner because I can't afford to just front the capital for thousands of units and hope someone notices it. And I don't want to crowdfund it because my crowdfunding schedule is already kind of packed. So right now, those games are difficult to get out. Wolves was my first attempt at that, and it was fine. I mean, it's on Barnes and Noble shelves right now, and it's on Amazon. That's great, but it's only fine in terms of it more or less made its money back. It's certainly not, going to win any giant awards or keep the company afloat. So yeah, those are tough decisions. And the other half of that equation is that I think because of a lot of systemic issues, I've literally had one person come to me from outside the company, a native person, come to me and pitch their game. And technically, I would take pitches from anybody. Like I don't care if they're native or not. I would take a pitch from anybody. And I mean, I'm a game publisher. Yes, I'm native, and yes, a lot of my games are native published games. But I'm just a game publisher. I've never said that I would not take a non or a native, a non-native game. So the fact that I've only had one person, and that person was not only really underqualified and didn't really know what they were doing, and I don't mean that as an insult. They were just very new to the industry and didn't really know what they were talking about. And I tried to encourage that person to have a further conversation. And when I didn't give them the answer that they liked, they just stopped talking to me. That's really frustrating. But again, I think that points back to systemic issues, which is if you don't have enough money to buy modern board games, how the hell could you ever be interested in designing one, right? You have to have a history in playing board games before you start wanting to design them. And how many of us can afford to be in this hobby space, right? It's a pretty small group of us. It's pretty privileged. So
Yeah, you have a good point. You've also mentioned in some of your writing that you're interested in pitching games with indigenous perspectives to larger publishers. What has kind of driven that interest? And then also, how do you choose a publisher who's going to do right
mm.
by you, or at least that you think's going to?
Yeah, so that's getting into some questions that again lead toward some of my larger decisions in upcoming months. Right now I'm designing a bead crafting game called Adela, and Adela is this really visually pleasing little puzzle game with beads where you're more or less crafting a choker necklace, and I think it's a lot of fun. And as I thought about this game, I thought, well, I can go down the route where I try to crowdfund this. Maybe it will fund, maybe it won't. But if I take this game and try to pitch it to a different publisher, I'm just going to throw out some names for example, like folks like Asmodee or Renegade Games or Smirk and Dagger, or I don't know, any of these games that have, or any of these publishers rather, that have a much wider reach, then isn't that fulfilling my goal, my mission statement, which is to get modern native themed games into more hands, both natives and non-natives, right? That's fulfilling that goal. So don't I have an obligation then to set my ego aside and say I don't need to publish this. I need to give this game to somebody who can get it into more hands. And I think that's kind of where I'm at right now. And I think the crux of sort of my major announcement will be that Coyote and Crow Games is going to move more specifically toward creating content that is only focused on the world of Coyote and Crow, and that all of my other design work is going to go out of house. I think that's best for my mission statement. So yeah, heard it here first.
Yes, I won't press you anymore because I know that you've got your own stuff to come. I'm just naturally curious, but
Yeah.
the other thing that we'll move into the softy questions because I think it's really important to talk about. You mentioned you want to make games because you have a lot of rootedness in gaming.
Yeah.
So, what have you been playing recently that truly brings you joy?
So it's funny that you use brings me joy, because brings me joy is different than necessarily like games that I just enjoy. There are a lot of games like my favorite game still to this day is Android Netrunner. And that game tickles parts of my brain that just, man, I don't know what it does, but it just makes me engage in that game in a way I do not engage in other games. But if you're talking about joy, I have found, specifically with the world's political climate and everything that's going on in the world today, that our gaming group has drifted more and more toward board games that just make us happy, even if we don't win the game. They are making us feel good about being at the table and with each other. And I think the three games that keep coming back to our table more than others, and there's quite a few, but the three that keep coming back are Creature Comforts by Kids Table Board Games, um, Wingspan, specifically with the Oceania expansion. Shout out to Elizabeth Hargrave for making an amazing game there, and Josh Capel for making Creature Comforts. And then Dune Imperium. I'm in love with the mechanics on Dune Imperium. It's that perfect mix of like simple choices, but with lots of like crunch underneath, where you're like, your one choice might be simple to play out, but it has real ramifications for the course of the game. And I love those kinds of choices.
Oh, it's fantastic. And then if people want to find you online, where do you most like to be found?
Yeah. Coyoteandcrow.net, which I believe has a link to our link tree on there, which has all of our other sites. KiteandCrow.net is a great place for information. We have a fantastic Discord community that discusses all things. Like we focus a lot on the RPG stuff there, but there's discussions about everything there. A fantastic Discord. The link to that is also on our webpage at KiteandCrow.net. I'm on Blue Sky. I'm still technically on Twitter at Coyote and Crow Games. You can find you just do a search for Coyote and Crow, you'll find me. But God, Twitter has just become a hellscape. And I'm making a very pathetic attempt on TikTok, but I am not a TikToker and I'm way too old for that. So my TikToks have bad Instagram reel feels. So I wouldn't suggest that unless you're really brave.
Fantastic. Connor, thank you so much for coming on. I really, really appreciate this conversation, and I'm
Yeah.
super excited for what we're going to hear next.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. This has been a great talk and you've asked me some fantastic questions.
All right, everybody out there, I'm Beyond Solitaire everywhere. In case you didn't know, you should go check out Ahutika. I put a link in the show notes. And most of all, everybody, please like, subscribe, comment, ask questions, and most of all, happy gaming.